In the heart of winter, where snow blankets the world in silence, three chilling tales emerge from the shadows. A ghostly bride, forever searching in a frostbitten cemetery. A mysterious in that traps its guests in a labyrinth of whispers and footsteps. And a forgotten village buried beneath the snow, where shadowy figures roam its frozen streets. Each story beckons you into a world where the cold is not the only thing to fear, and the line between the living and the lost begins to blur. Dare to uncover the secrets hidden beneath the snow, but beware, for some mysteries are meant to remain frozen in time. The Ghost in the Blizzard. The night was eerily silent, broken only by the howling of the wind and the crunch of snow under Emily's boots. It was the heart of winter in rural Minnesota, where temperatures plunged well below freezing and snowstorms could blanket the land in minutes. Emily, a young and dedicated nurse, had received an urgent call to cover a late-night shift at a small hospital nearly 30 miles away. Driving through the blizzard was perilous. The snow fell so heavily that her car's headlights barely penetrated the darkness, illuminating only swirling flurries and the vague outlines of trees lining the desolate road. Emily gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white. She couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in her chest since she left home. Her car's heater struggled to combat the biting cold, and the radio offered no solace, its static crackling faintly as if the storm had swallowed the airwaves. Emily's breath fogged the windshield as she muttered reassurances to herself. "Just keep going. The hospital's not far now," she whispered, her voice trembling. As she turned a bend, the road narrowed, flanked by thick woods. The storm seemed to grow fiercer, and visibility dwindled to almost nothing. Suddenly, through the haze of snow, Emily spotted a figure standing on the side of the road. She slammed on the brakes, her car skidding slightly before coming to a halt. Her heart pounded as she peered through the windshield. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered white dress that seemed woefully inadequate for the freezing weather. She cradled a small bundle, a baby, Emily realized with a jolt. The woman's long, dark hair was matted with snow, and her face was pale, almost translucent under the harsh glare of the headlights. Emily rolled down her window slightly, wincing as the icy wind whipped into the car. "Mom, are you okay?" she called out. The woman didn't respond, only looked at her with wide, hollow eyes. Emily's heart ached at the sight. She couldn't leave her and the baby out in the storm. "Get in. It's too cold out there," Emily urged, unlocking the passenger door. The woman hesitated for a moment before silently climbing into the car. She moved with an unnatural stillness, her feet making no sound as they brushed the floor mat. Emily shivered, though she wasn't sure if it was from the cold or something else. The woman sat stiffly, clutching the baby close to her chest. Emily glanced over, trying to catch her gaze. "Are you hurt? Where are you heading?" she asked gently. Still, the woman said nothing. Her silence was unsettling, but Emily reminded herself that the woman might be in shock. She decided to focus on driving, though she couldn't shake the growing discomfort in the pit of her stomach. As they drove, the car felt colder, despite the heater blowing at full blast. Emily noticed her breath fogging up inside the vehicle, and her hands began to feel numb. She risked another glance at the woman, whose expression hadn't changed. The baby in her arms remained completely still, wrapped tightly in a thin, faded blanket. "I'm taking you to the hospital," Emily said, her voice wavering slightly. "You'll be safe there." The woman turned her head slowly to look at Emily. Her lips parted, as if she were about to speak, but no words came out. Instead, Emily thought she heard a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. It sounded like her name. Emily froze. "Did you just say something?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman didn't respond, her eyes fixed on Emily with an intensity that made her grip the wheel tighter. The road seemed to stretch on forever, the storm growing fiercer with each passing minute. Emily's unease turned to outright fear when she realized the landmarks she should have passed weren't appearing. It was as if the road itself had changed, leading her deeper into an unfamiliar wilderness. The trees loomed closer, their branches clawing at the car like skeletal hands. "This isn't right," Emily muttered, her voice shaking. She glanced at the woman again, but her passenger's gaze was fixed straight ahead, unblinking. The baby remained eerily still, and Emily couldn't hear the faintest sound of breathing. Panic set in. Emily pulled the car to the side of the road, her hands trembling. She turned to the woman, her voice breaking. "What is going on? Who are you?" The woman slowly turned to face her, and for the first time, she smiled. It wasn't a comforting smile. It was cold and hollow, devoid of any warmth. Emily felt her blood run cold as the woman spoke, her voice a chilling whisper that seemed to echo inside the car. "You can't save me." Before Emily could react, the woman and the baby dissolved into a swirling mist, vanishing into the air. The car's interior returned to its normal temperature, and the oppressive silence lifted, replaced by the sound of the storm outside. Emily sat frozen, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. She glanced at the passenger's seat, now empty, but noticed something that made her stomach drop. The seat was soaked, as if someone had been sitting there, dripping with melted snow. In the faint light, she saw a single handprint on the frosted window, a child's handprint. Shaking, Emily restarted the car and drove as fast as she dared through the storm. When she finally reached the hospital, she burst into the emergency room, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. Her colleagues rushed to her side, bombarding her with questions, but she could barely speak. Later, after she had calmed down, Emily recounted her experience. The older nurses exchanged uneasy glances before one of them spoke. "That stretch of road, it's infamous around here. Years ago, a woman and her baby were stranded in a blizzard. They never made it to safety. By the time rescuers found them, it was too late. People say she's still out there, searching for someone to save her." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. She never drove that road again, and every winter, she couldn't help but think of the woman in white and the stillness of that bundled child. The memory lingered like a shadow, a haunting reminder of the storm and the ghost she could never forget. The inn without an exit. The snow fell in thick, swirling flakes, blanketing the Colorado countryside in a sheet of white. Jessica, a passionate photographer in her late 20s, had been driving for hours to reach her destination, a remote mountain known for its breathtaking winter landscapes. Her car's trunk was packed with photography equipment, and her mind buzzed with ideas for capturing the ethereal beauty of the season. As the afternoon faded into evening, the storm grew worse. Visibility dropped, and the winding mountain roads became treacherous. Jessica's knuckles turned white as she gripped the steering wheel, her breath fogging up the windshield despite the heater's efforts. The road ahead vanished into a blur of snow and darkness. She needed shelter, fast. Her phone's GPS was useless without a signal, and the nearest town was miles away. Just as panic began to creep in, Jessica spotted a faint light through the trees. She squinted, realizing it was coming from an old-fashioned sign hanging above a weathered wooden building. The sign read, "Silver Pines Inn." Relief washed over her as she turned into the driveway. The inn stood alone, surrounded by towering pines, its windows glowing warmly against the snowy night. It looked like something out of a postcard, but there was an air of isolation about it that made her hesitate. Still, with the storm worsening, she had no choice. Jessica parked her car and hurried inside, shaking off the snow that clung to her coat. The lobby was cozy, with a crackling fireplace and antique furniture. An elderly woman stood behind the check-in counter, her silver hair neatly pinned back and her eyes sharp despite her years. "Welcome to Silver Pines Inn," the woman said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're lucky you found us in this storm." Jessica nodded, her teeth chattering. "I didn't think I'd make it much farther. Do you have a room?" "Of course, dear," the woman replied, pulling a key from a wooden rack. "Room 7 at the end of the hall. Breakfast is at 7 a.m. Jessica thanked her and took the key, noticing how cold it felt in her hand. She climbed the creaky staircase and found her room, which was small but clean, with a heavy quilt draped over the bed. Exhausted, she set her camera bag on the desk and fell onto the bed without even removing her boots. She intended to rest for only a few minutes, but the warmth of the room lulled her into a deep sleep. When she awoke, it was dark. The wind howled outside, and the shadows cast by the flickering lamp seemed to dance on the walls. Disoriented, Jessica glanced at her watch. It was just past midnight. A faint sound reached her ears, the soft creak of footsteps in the hallway. She tensed, wondering if another guest was wandering the inn at this late hour. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped abruptly outside her door. Jessica held her breath, her heart pounding. After a long pause, there was a gentle knock. "Hello," she called out, her voice shaky. No response. The knock came again, this time more insistent. Summoning her courage, Jessica crossed the room and opened the door. The hallway was empty. Shivering, she shut the door and locked it, her unease growing. Determined to distract herself, she unpacked her camera and reviewed the photos she had taken earlier in the day. As she flipped through them, a chill ran down her spine. Mixed among the familiar landscapes were images she hadn't taken. Dimly lit hallways, a shadowy figure standing at the end of a corridor, and finally, a close-up of her own face as she slept. Her hands trembled as she stared at the screen. The last photo was impossible. She had been alone in the room. Or had she? Jessica's first instinct was to leave, but the storm outside made that impossible. Instead, she decided to confront the innkeeper. Grabbing her camera, she made her way downstairs. The lobby was empty, the fire reduced to smoldering embers. Jessica called out, but no one answered. She found the elderly woman in a back room, sitting in a rocking chair and knitting by candlelight. The scene was oddly serene, but Jessica couldn't shake her fear. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling. "Did anyone else check in tonight?" The woman looked up, her expression unreadable. "No, did. You're our only guest." Jessica's stomach churned. "Then how do you explain this?" She held up her camera, showing the photos. The woman's eyes flickered with something Jessica couldn't identify. Recognition, perhaps, or fear. "You must be mistaken," the woman said, her tone firm. "Perhaps the storm is playing tricks on you." Frustrated, Jessica returned to her room, but sleep was out of the question. She paced, her mind racing. Around 3 a.m., she heard the footsteps again. This time, they didn't stop outside her door. Instead, they seemed to wander the entire inn, echoing through the empty halls. Unable to take it any longer, Jessica grabbed her coat and decided to explore. Armed with her camera, she ventured into the hallways, following the sound of the footsteps. The corridors seemed to stretch endlessly, and the inn's layout felt labyrinthine, as if it were changing around her. She turned a corner and stopped abruptly. At the far end of the hall stood a figure, a woman in a long, tattered dress. Her face was obscured by shadows, but her posture was unnatural, her head tilted at an odd angle. Jessica's breath caught in her throat as the figure began to move toward her, its footsteps unnaturally slow and deliberate. Snapping a photo out of instinct, Jessica turned and ran. The hall seemed to twist and shift, leading her in circles. Finally, she burst into the lobby, only to find it completely dark. The fireplace was cold, and the front door was nowhere to be seen. Panic set in as she realized the inn had no exits. The windows showed only darkness, and every door she tried led to another corridor. Jessica's camera dangled uselessly from her neck as she stumbled through the building, calling for help. Eventually, she found herself back in her room. Exhausted and terrified, she barricaded the door and sat against it, clutching her camera like a lifeline. She didn't sleep that night, her eyes fixed on the door as the footsteps continued outside. When morning finally came, the inn was silent. Jessica cautiously opened the door, half expecting to see the figure from the night before. Instead, she found the hallway bathed in soft sunlight. The storm had passed, and everything seemed normal. Determined to leave, Jessica hurried downstairs. The lobby was as cozy as it had been when she arrived, with the fire crackling warmly. The elderly woman stood behind the counter, smiling as if nothing had happened. "Did you sleep well, dear?" she asked. Jessica didn't answer. She handed over the key and bolted for the door, which was now plainly visible. As she stepped outside, the fresh snow crunched under her boots. Her car was buried under a layer of snow, but she didn't care. She dug it out as quickly as possible and drove away without looking back. Later, Jessica searched online for information about the Silver Pines Inn. What she found made her blood run cold. The inn had burned down decades ago in a fire that claimed the lives of all its occupants. It was said that on stormy nights, travelers could still see its lights and hear the footsteps of those who never left. Jessica never spoke of her experience, but she couldn't forget the photos on her camera. The last image, her own face, staring wide-eyed into the lens, remained etched in her memory, a haunting reminder of the night she stayed at the inn without an exit. The lost village beneath the snow. Winter's chill gripped the small town of Cedar Hollow, nestled in the shadow of the Appalachian Mountains. For decades, the townsfolk had whispered about the mysterious village that once lay deep in the forest, a place swallowed by snow and forgotten by time. Some called it Frost Hollow, others simply referred to it as the Lost Village. Legend had it that anyone who ventured too far into the woods during a winter storm risked never returning. Samantha, a history professor in her early 30s, had always been fascinated by the tale. She'd grown up listening to her grandmother recount stories of Frost Hollow's inhabitants who vanished without a trace one brutal winter over a century ago. Skeptics dismissed the tale as folklore, but Samantha believed there was some truth to it. When she received a grant to research local legends, Samantha knew exactly where to begin. Armed with her notebook, camera, and a sense of adventure, she set out to uncover the truth about the lost village. Her plan was simple: explore the forest, document any findings, and piece together the story. She hadn't anticipated the blizzard that would change everything. The first day of her expedition was uneventful. Samantha parked her SUV near the forest's edge and trekked into the snowy expanse, following an old trail marked on a map she had borrowed from the local library. The trees were skeletal in their winter dormancy, their branches heavy with snow. The air was crisp, the only sound the crunch of her boots and the occasional call of a distant bird. By mid-afternoon, she stumbled upon the remnants of an ancient stone well. Excitement surged through her veins. This could be a clue. She snapped photos, took notes, and marked the spot on her map. As the sun dipped below the horizon, she pitched her tent nearby, determined to continue her search in the morning. But as night fell, the forest grew unnaturally quiet. Samantha lay in her sleeping bag, staring at the tent's fabric roof. The wind had died down, and the usual nocturnal sounds, rustling leaves, distant howls, were absent. Instead, there was a heavy stillness that pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. Then she heard it, faint, almost imperceptible, like the sound of children laughing. Samantha sat up, her heart pounding. She unzipped the tent and peered into the darkness. The snow reflected the pale light of the moon, illuminating the forest in an eerie glow. There was no one there. She told herself it was her imagination, the product of exhaustion and excitement. But as she lay back down, the laughter returned, louder this time. It seemed to come from all around her, echoing through the trees. Samantha clutched her flashlight, debating whether to investigate or stay put. Before she could decide, a blinding flash lit up the forest, followed by an intense cold that seeped into her bones. When Samantha awoke, the blizzard had arrived. Snow whipped around her tent, and the world outside was a swirling white void. She packed up her gear as quickly as possible, but the storm made navigation nearly impossible. Her map was useless. The landmarks were obscured, and every direction looked the same. Hours passed as she stumbled through the snow, her legs growing weaker with every step. Just as despair began to take hold, she saw it, the outline of a building through the storm. Relief flooded her as she staggered toward it. The structure was a wooden cabin, its windows frosted over, and its roof sagging under the weight of the snow. Smoke curled from the chimney, and warm light spilled from the windows. Samantha knocked on the door, her numb fingers barely making a sound. It opened before she could knock again. An elderly man stood in the doorway, his face lined with age, but his eyes sharp and bright. "Come in before you freeze," he said, stepping aside to let her enter. The cabin's interior was modest but cozy, with a roaring fire in the hearth and the smell of stew wafting from a pot on the stove. Samantha sank into a chair near the fire, grateful for the warmth. The man handed her a blanket and a cup of tea, which she accepted with trembling hands. "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse. "I got caught in the storm." The man nodded. "You're lucky to have found this place. Not many do." Samantha's curiosity flared. "Is this Frost Hollow?" she asked. The man's expression darkened. He didn't answer immediately, instead stirring the stew with deliberate slowness. Finally, he said, "You should rest. The storm will pass by morning." Despite his evasive response, Samantha's exhaustion overwhelmed her. She fell asleep in the chair, the warmth of the fire lulling her into a dreamless slumber. When she awoke, the cabin was empty. The fire had burned down to embers, and the stew pot was gone. Puzzled, Samantha called out for the man, but there was no answer. She stepped outside, expecting to see the storm's aftermath. Instead, she froze in shock. The cabin wasn't alone. Surrounding it were dozens of other structures, cottages, a church, a general store, all in varying states of decay. Icicles hung from rooftops, and snowdrifts piled high against the walls. It was a village, eerily silent and lifeless. Heart-pounding, Samantha wandered through the streets. The buildings were frozen in time, their interiors filled with relics of another era. She found a diary in one of the homes, its pages brittle but legible. The entries told of harsh winters, dwindling supplies, and a mysterious illness that had swept through the village. The final entry sent a shiver down her spine. "Asterisk, the snow will not stop. We are trapped. The children say they see figures in the woods, beckoning to them. I fear we are no longer alone. Asterisk." As she read, Samantha became aware of a change in the air. The stillness was gone, replaced by faint whispers and the sensation of being watched. She turned to find the streets no longer empty. Shadowy figures moved among the buildings, their forms indistinct but unmistakably human. Panic set in. Samantha ran back to the cabin, slamming the door behind her. The whispers grew louder, accompanied by soft taps on the windows. She barricaded herself inside, clutching her notebook as if it were a talisman. Night fell, and the whispers turned to voices. They called her name, their tones a mix of pleading and anger. Samantha covered her ears, but the voices seemed to come from within her mind. She lit a lantern, its flickering light casting long shadows that danced across the walls. Just as she thought she would lose her sanity, the storm returned. The wind howled, drowning out the voices. Samantha felt an inexplicable pull to leave the cabin. She grabbed her gear and stepped outside, the snow blinding her once again. When the storm subsided, Samantha found herself back at the stone well she'd discovered on her first day. The village was gone, as if it had never existed. Dazed and disoriented, she made her way back to her SUV, which was miraculously unburied and waiting for her. She returned to Cedar Hollow. Her story met with skepticism, but the photos on her camera told a different tale. Images of the village, the diary, and the shadowy figures. Samantha's findings sparked a flurry of interest among historians and paranormal enthusiasts, but she refused to go back. The lost village remained a mystery, its secrets buried beneath the snow. But Samantha knew the truth. Frost Hollow wasn't just a legend, it was a warning, and some places are meant to stay forgotten. If you enjoy spine-chilling stories and mysterious legends, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of my newest videos. Your support helps us bring more thrilling content your way. Join the adventure and be part of the community today.